the war continues to rage in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine. And it seems that the Ukrainians are making some advances. They have liberated some territory that was under Putin's control. Putin has, I read, called upon a kind of draft reserve of Russians, which means he needs more troops. But it's not easy to say what's really going on because the Western media accounts are typically propagandistic. They reflect a party line. They reflect leaks that are coming out of the deep state in this country, and so they are not wholly to be trusted. Nevertheless, Putin recently gave a speech, and this was a speech that was far more apocalyptic and anti-American than what we've heard from Putin. Putin has had an anti-American thrust, no question about it, but this escalates things and gives us a window into how Putin is thinking. And so I'd like to go through a few key points in Putin's speech and kind of comment on them. So the first point that Putin makes is that after the fall of the Soviet Union, he says, a whole bunch of Russians or people of Russian heritage were separated from their Russian roots. And I think what he's talking about here are the breakaway republics, places like Ukraine, which do have people of Russian origin, and obviously people who are part of Russia historically, people who are part of Russia culturally, and in some cases people who think of themselves as Russian but are nevertheless physically in Ukraine. And Putin's point is that these breakaway republics, he says, quote, that these people have never voted for this breakup. They never voted, in other words, to be separated from Russia. He says they have expressed their will. They are now our citizens forever. So it's a way of Putin basically reclaiming these republics and claiming that they are somehow still part of Russia. Reminds me of Putin's famous statement going back several years now that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest disaster to befall Russia in all of its history. So there's a certain kind of effort here, obviously not under the same type of Soviet communism, but nevertheless, to reassemble the Russian Empire of the 20th century. Now, Putin goes on to say that elite circles in the West never thought Russia would come back, meaning after the Cold War. And he says they are not happy with our resource-rich country that refuses to give up our culture. Then he says they are hostile to traditional values and cultures. And here we have a hint of what Putin is doing. He is trying, and by the way, Xi in China the same, to assemble a coalition of traditional cultures around the world against the West. The West is portrayed here. Remember, the Islamic radicals portray the West as the great Satan. And this is the same thing. The West stands for atheism. It stands for moral depravity. It stands for corrupting traditional cultures. And Putin goes on to say, in the United States model, all countries must surrender their sovereignty to the United States. He says the United States is having a hybrid war against us. They're fighting through surrogates. So there's no open declaration of war between the United States and Russia, but the United States is supplying weaponry. And so the fight is going on, but it's going on indirectly. He goes on to say Japan, Germany, and South Korea are militarily occupied by the U.S. They pretend to be partners, but they are vassal states. The United States spies on and intimidates their leaders. He goes on to even imply America is engineering the destruction of Europe. He says, without quite saying it, he says that America has, quote, attacked Europe's infrastructure. Now, implying here that it's the Biden administration that has torpedoed the Nord Stream pipeline. The United States is accusing Russia of doing it, and the Russians are accusing Biden of doing it. He goes on to say Putin does U.S. dollar hegemony plunders the world's riches, propping up its racket economy at everybody else's expense. And the United States is using the fact that it's the reserve currency of the world to control the world. And we can see that Putin, and we know Putin and China have been conspiring to do this, create a rival currency, maybe even a basket of currencies that removes the dollar from this enviable status of being the world's sole reserve currency. But listen to this. Russians do not want our children to be made into sexual deviants. Western elites are openly satanic. So notice here the kind of close parallel, as I say, between Islamic radical rhetoric and now Russian rhetoric coming out of Putin. And if you listen to Xi's rhetoric coming out of China, it's not dissimilar. The accusations begin to all fade one into the other. And so we're seeing here the emergence of an anti-Western alliance. But they're not against us because we're for freedom. They're not against us because we are a democracy. It's true, Putin is an autocracy. It's true that China is an autocracy. But hey, the United States is becoming increasingly autocratic in our own way. Many of the civil liberties that so many of us took for granted are now jeopardized. So this line between the free world and the non-free world is not as clear as it once was. But I think it's important to understand our adversaries, to see what they're saying about us. And unfortunately, it seems in many ways the Biden administration is playing right into their hands.